Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to our policy polls on the truth about current food and meat prices. Please welcome our speakers, Jason Lusk, Distinguished Professor and Head of Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University, and Darren Bask, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon. My name is Darren Baxt, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. And we're really fortunate to have one of the top agricultural economists in the country today, Dr. Jason Lusk, joining us to discuss the truth about current food and meat prices. Jason, as you heard, is Distinguished Professor and Head of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. There's been recent attention on higher food prices, in large part because the Biden administration is asserting that current high prices are due to a small number of dominant players in the meat processing industry. And we're going to discuss this assertion and a lot more. So let's get right to it. Jason, it's really nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Darren, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and with Heritage.
So Jason, I think a good place to start is, what is the current state of food prices in general, and are they higher than usual?
I mean, certainly since the onset of the pandemic, we've seen food prices increase at a higher than usual rate. So just to give you some sense, since January of 2020, food prices are up about 7% over that roughly year and a half time period. And so 7%, you could question whether that's large or small. It's certainly that if you look at specific components, meat prices have risen at an even faster rate. So beef, for example, is up about 12% in the most recent data compared to the beginning of the pandemic. But if you look at just sort of year-over-year changes, the sort of annual changes in food prices, it's higher than what we've come to expect in the past. So, for example, in the 10 years or so, before the pandemic, we were, on average, looking about 1% to 2% increase in food prices, and we're certainly much higher than that at the moment. So more around 3% to 4%. And so we're higher than normal, but we're certainly nowhere near, say, 1970s or 80s level of inflation.
That's kind of also, I'm just wondering, that's kind of a small window of time that we're looking at, right? I mean, prices are going to fluctuate a lot.
They do, that's right. And that's particularly true of meat prices. And I know we're going to talk more about meat in particular in a moment, but of all the food prices, meat prices tend to be more volatile than others. And so you do see, prices moving up and down. And even over the last year and a half, there's a lot of wiggling around that happens over that time period. But yeah, in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively small time period.
So a lot of attention has been put on meat and poultry prices playing a role in the higher food prices. How big of a role is it playing? What are we seeing with meat and poultry prices? Sure.
So, if you look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the food component of that, meat is a big component of food prices because we spend a relatively high share of our food dollar on meat items. We like to eat meat. Meat is a relatively expensive item. So when meat prices change, it tends to push overall food prices. So what are we seeing specifically in the meat sector? Back in the initial run up of food prices that happened last March, meat prices increased along with all other food items. But the thing that really moved meat prices were the meat packing plant shutdowns that happened in April, May, June of 2020. And I probably don't need to recount that for all the listeners, but that saw a very significant period of price increases in beef and pork, less so in chicken. And then interestingly, one question I get sometimes from journalists and others is, well, don't prices just always increase and they never come back down? Well, that's not actually true. If we look at April, May, and June of 2021, their prices were actually, beef and pork prices were actually lower than they were the prior year at the retail level. But we've seen really in the last month or two, those prices starting to come back up again a bit, and part of that's just strong demand. So a lot of demand by countries like China, and we're also seeing pressure on feed prices. So corn, soybean prices are increasing. That's adding cost to the system, among many other costs that are in the system at the moment.
So isn't one of the factors, like on the demand side, is you're still getting a decent amount, getting high demand in grocery stores, but people are going out more, so you're getting so you have this new demand with the restaurants and, out of home eating?
That's part of it. I mean, certainly it's the case that spending on food away from home hasn't fully, depending on which data set we look at, but it hasn't fully recovered to the pre-pandemic levels, but it's much better than it was a year and a half ago. And so the overall demand picture, when you look at food at home and food away from home for meat, is a really strong picture for that sector. For whatever reason, consumers are wanting meat in their diets, and you can see that on the demand side. And then the other factor that I alluded to as well is we've just seen really strong demand for U.S. meat by our foreign customers, particularly in China, but in other parts of the world too. So you add relatively stable and strong domestic demand for meat, and then on top of that, really strong increasing demand for our meat products by our trading partners, and that combined picture is one that's really helped pull up meat prices.
So I mean, it sounds like basic economics at play. So the USDA on their website, they kind of explain the fact there's higher prices with meat and poultry, and they don't point to high concentration levels within the meat processing as a cause. I don't know if that was, right or wrong, but so I'd ask you, is high concentration a possible cause for the higher current prices for meat that we're seeing now?
Of course, anything is possible. And, I do want to say at the onset, there are a very large number of lawsuits going on at the moment in the meat sectors, different allegations, different companies involved in different ones of them. And so, of course, any one of those particular allegations, might be true at some point in time. But if you just take a step back and look at sort of the big picture, while it is true that meat processing is relatively concentrated, so for example, the four largest firms produce about 80% of all beef and pork. It's a little bit lower in chicken. That number hasn't changed a lot over time. So if the argument is that over the last year and a half, meat prices have increased significantly, concentration, while it's high, that hasn't changed. So you can't explain a change with something that's been held constant. So that relatively high degree of concentration in the meatpacking sector is something that's been with us for a long period of time. It's not something that's changed recently. And by and large, the academic literature that exists on that concentration suggests that the main impact of that concentration is lower prices to food consumers, because those companies, by being large, have economies of scale. The cost of production of each pound of beef or pork that's produced is much lower than it would be if we had much smaller packing plants. So there's a lot of academic research on this question, and the net effect is pretty clear that high level of concentration has actually pulled down prices for consumers rather than pushed it up.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of take even a step back, just kind of a bigger picture economic question, maybe hopefully not too wonky. There seems to be kind of an underlying assumption that short-term high prices are somehow a bad thing, and I just kind of want to see if you could explain like why prices themselves are like a really important way to convey information, so that the market kind of responds and kind of gets back into what's called equilibrium. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Darren. And so maybe we could back up, to one of the earlier episodes that I mentioned when we had the meatpacking plant shut down. So, workers started to become, catch COVID-19 in, really late April and May of 2020. And as a result, those packing plants shut down as they tried to retool and, implement efforts to make sure the virus didn't spread too much. And so as a result, there was less meat being produced, less meat being put on the market. So how do you tell consumers they have to cut back? Well, grocery stores can put up signs, and some did put up signs that said you can only buy 2 pounds. But you can go to a different grocery store and buy 2 more packages or 2 more pounds at that other store. So, absent that sort of explicit communication, prices are the mechanism by which we as consumers get a signal that we need to be more judicious. That rising price to us was telling us, hey, there's less meat on the market. Somebody's going to have to cut back, and that price is the mechanism by which we allocate that scarcity. And oh, by the way, that higher price does the opposite on the producer side of things. So we were talking about market power just a bit earlier, and I think there's some sort of conspiratorial views, like maybe the meat packers did this to, they intentionally shut down to drive up prices. Well, when prices are that high, you have every incentive to get back up and running, right? If retail prices are increasing and you're a meat packer, you don't want to lose out on those higher prices. That's profit you're giving up if you're not running your plant and taking advantage of that. So that higher price is also providing all the incentives on the production side of things to get back to work, to get those plants back up and running, to find incentives to get your workers to show up, to social distance them, to implement PPE so that you don't shut down again. That's what those higher prices signal on the production side of things. That provides the economic incentive to get back up and running and get prices back, hopefully to a more normal level, which is indeed what we saw.
I don't know if I've seen this as much this year as last year. There's kind of this idea that there's a paradox of, why farmers are not getting as much money. They're not getting paid as much, while at the same time, consumers are paying a lot more. And there's this kind of feeling like there's some type of conspiracy as a result of why are farmers getting so little sometimes, but the retail prices are going up, and then they blame the meat processors. Is there a paradox, or am I missing something here?
So there's 2 things going on there. So first, there is something that looks like a paradox that you referred to. So particularly that era when we had the meat packing plant shutdowns, at that time period, retail meat prices were increasing at the same time that farm level prices of cattle and hogs were falling. And that did seem a bit odd, but it's actually something that doesn't require anything nefarious. It's just basic economics 101. If you'd have come to me before any of this happened and just asked me, Jason, what do you think would happen if we took some of the largest meat packers and shut them down for a few weeks? And that price phenomenon, that widening spread between retail and farm prices, is exactly what I'd predicted. And here's why. So you remove a big chunk of packing capacity. What that means is those packers can no longer, say, take as many cattle. In other words, there's too many cattle sitting around relative to the ability to process them. And again, getting back to prices, the way that gets signaled back to the producer is prices have to fall for that signal to reach out. So packers reduce their demand for livestock because they can't process them. That puts downward pressure on livestock prices. And by the way, that lower prices, again, speaking about signals, what beef producers did in some cases, they held cattle back. They didn't put as many into feedlots at that time period. But at the same time, because those packing plants aren't running, there isn't as much meat being produced on the market. So a reduction in the supply of meat, but you still have the same number of buyers out there, the same number of grocery stores and restaurants that want meat. And so they're bidding against each other for a smaller quantity of meat that's out there, and that pulls up the retail prices. And so you do get this widening spread when you have a disruption in the packing sector. So one thing I want to emphasize that I think is important is, that was sort of a temporary phenomena that we did have this really widening spread, but then things returned to something, more closer to normal within a month or 2 time period. And there's this view, and I've seen it repeated by the Biden administration in a couple of recent documents about the packing sector, that packers were getting rich while farmers were, going broke. But if you actually look at data on how farmers fared over the course of 2020, it's actually a much prettier picture than most people realize. So one measure of sort of overall health of the agricultural economy is something called net farm income. basically sort of aggregate profitability of the farm sector. It's something the U.S. Department of Agriculture calculates every year. And if you look at from 2019 to 2020, so prior pandemic to the year of the pandemic, net farm income increased by 20%. Now, it's in all fairness, a big chunk of that increase was because of a huge increase in government payments to farmers. So about 40 billion or so dollars in direct payments went to farmers over that year. But even if you look at USDA's projection for 2021, so going from 2020, which has already increased over the previous year, and now from 2020 to 2021, they're projecting another 20% increase in net farm income. And that's not because of an increase in government payments. In fact, government payments are projected to fall back to more normal levels. And it's almost entirely because of higher commodity prices. So in fact, if you look again at projections for net farm income for this year in 2021, it's higher than it's been in the last 8 years. And there's only 3 years over the last 20 that have been higher. So, at least in terms of aggregate farm economy, it's actually in pretty darn good shape at the moment.
So I've asked this, I think you've answered this before. Let me ask this, couple questions. First of all, there's kind of this assumption that there are high concentration levels in meat processing, and you gave some of the numbers. My first question is, one, is it true? Do you consider the numbers in poultry kind of individually, like poultry, pork, and beef, to kind of those industries to have what would be thought of as high concentration levels, whatever that means, how we'd measure that? And then the second question is, and you kind of got to this as well, is high concentration in and of itself a bad thing for consumers, or could it be a good thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good questions. So, I mentioned the 4 firm concentration ratio that is roughly 80% in beef and pork, a little bit lower in chicken. Another way to look at the concentration ratio is, instead of looking at, a company like, say, Tyson or JBS, instead look at plants, individual producing plants. And those are also relatively highly concentrated. So you take the 10 largest beef packing plants, they produce about 60% of all the beef in the country. On the pork side, it's something like 15 of the largest pork packing plants produce about 60% of all the pork in this country. It's less concentrated than some industries, but it's relatively concentrated. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's anti-competitive behavior. And I mentioned those 10 or 15 largest, large beef and pork packing plants. They're in different locations. They're competing against each other in local markets for cattle and hogs. And so it really depends on the nature of the competition between those two. I think chicken is an interesting example too. As often, there's actually, again, quite a large number of lawsuits going on in the chicken industry at the moment. Chicken has become much more affordable over time. In fact, you look at the rise in, there's been an increase in meat consumption over the past 20, 30 years, almost entirely driven by increases in chicken consumption, because chicken has increasingly become affordable, more relatively affordable over time. And so that concentration, you got to look at why it's large. Is it large because of sort of unfair competitive practices, or did you get large because you were successful? And I alluded to some of the academic literature before, but the data is very clear that the larger you are on a packing plant side of things, the lower your average costs of production. And so the main effect of that increase in size and concentration has been to bring down the average costs of production. And it's one of the challenges. I think people seem to want a more distributed system. Some people, I should say, want a more distributed system, sort of more smaller packing plants. But most of those plants are really at a cost disadvantage, just simply due to economies of scale. One other thing I should mention too that's really key, I think, to size here is, when you think about meat packing, is if you're a small meat packer, anybody can sell the T-bones and even perhaps the ground meat. Like that's not hard. Or selling the bacon, for example, off of a hog. But we're going to sell the snouts and the tails and the feet. and the hearts, the kidneys, all those things. If you want to make money, you got to have markets for those products too. And one advantage of that size is it enables the ability to find markets for those products that are kind of hard. And indeed, international consumers are often, the home for some of those, what we as Americans might consider more unusual products for those. And so a lot of what's going on in those export markets is we're finding value-added opportunities for products that we don't really want much here in this country. And so that additional size also comes with that comes the ability and the access to markets for some of these, what we might think of as unusual products, but you really need to sell them if you want to have profitability.
I want to kind of ask a question, at least not too much of a curveball, regarding kind of just food prices. Going to take a step back. Just in general, my understanding is that the households spend a lower percentage of their household income on food than they have in the past. Is that true? And how does that relate to meat prices too? Is meat prices generally come down overall? Or not?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Darren. We spend, it depends again on the data set, but roughly 10%, a little less than 10% of our disposable income on food in this country. That's lower than it's ever been in history, and it's lower than almost any other country in the world. So we live in many ways in the food world in an absolutely incredible time in terms of affordability of food, because that means we can spend 90% of our income on all the other things in life that we enjoy, like I don't know, getting to go to a football game, or going to an opera, or getting to donate to your favorite university. All those things you can afford to do because this basic necessity of life has become much more affordable over time relative to our incomes. And you see a similar story in the meat sector, that meat is much more affordable in this country than it is in many others abroad. So when we get back to these discussions about impacts of concentration or maybe anti-competitive behavior, I think it's really important to put it into that broader context that food is very affordable here. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the people that write in the so-called food movement era, it's interesting because they're often arguing we should be paying more for food, not less. I think that's a wrong-headed argument for a number of reasons, because there's also very strong evidence that the more affordable food is, that the better people are fed. There's less food insecurity, and so I think it's really actually, I think, one of the most amazing stories of success of our food and agricultural industry, that we've been able to make food so affordable for the vast majority of our population.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because lower income households, spend a greater percentage of their incomes on food than higher income households.
Mm-hmm.
And so if food prices are going to go up, I think there's evidence, and plenty of evidence, to show that there's going to be a disproportionate impact on lower income households. So it just seems kind of odd to want to drive prices higher, because you're going to hurt low income households more than other households. So what do you think about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so it's one reason that food policies that tend to push up food prices are one we tend to think about as being regressive, meaning that the burden is borne relatively more by lower income households. It's why some states, for example, don't have sales taxes on food. It's viewed as a again, a more equitable system, in the sense that anytime you're messing around with the price of food, that impact is being felt more heavily by those lower income households. And so one could say, like, who's felt the impacts of these recent price increases that we've seen during the pandemic more heavily? Probably lower income households have felt that burden a little more. But again, I think in the bigger, grander scheme of things, what we see is that really across the board for all consumers, those that share of income we spend on food has certainly come down.
It just seems like it's a little bit of a you want to be careful not to take like such a small snapshot in time and then make policy decisions based on a really small little snapshot in time. You need to.
Oh yeah, That's a great point, and it's even more important when we talk about meat and livestock. So you think about a cow, for example. Let's say you have this grand plan. You're going to get in the cattle business. You buy a cow, you buy a bull, and you're going to breed the outcome and sell the offspring. Okay, it's going to be 3 years roughly between when you make that decision and when you have something ready to sell. And so there are really long lags between decisions that are being made today and those outcomes that happen later. And indeed, I think, a lot of cattle producers, for example, are concerned about relative profitability that's going on right now. But honestly, a lot of that's happening because of these cycles that happen, particularly in livestock markets. There's a cattle cycle, there's a hog cycle, and a lot of that's coming about because actually, beef and cattle production were super profitable back in 2014 and 15. And when it was really profitable, then producers decided to add more inventory, to hold on to those heifers, to breed them, to try to produce more. And so some of what we're seeing, coming into the pandemic was that we had relatively large numbers of animals, a lot of beef, a lot of cattle, a lot of hogs on the market because of those lags. And so some of that sort of reduction in profitability we were seeing prior to the pandemic was because of these lags that you're seeing in the markets. And when you're dealing with things like animals, you can't just turn them on or off. There are these long biological lags. And so that's, exactly right. I mean, I think, I gave some testimony before the U.S. House Ag Committee, and that was at least what I hoped was my key message to them is, don't make decisions today based on what's happening today, because these are really longer run sectors. You want to make decisions today based on what's going to happen 3 to 5 years from now.
So getting in quickly to some policy issues, which we've been, but kind of specifically, I do a lot of regulatory issues, as my title says and my job title says. So the meat industry the meat processing is heavily regulated. And I just, what's interesting to me is that the Biden administration doesn't mention how federal regulation has played a role in reducing the number of meat processors. And there are some unusual regulatory regimes. I was wondering if you could kind of explain some of the unusual regulatory regimes that exist.
Yeah. So, in these discussions about market power, I think one of the first questions we should always ask ourselves is, what are the barriers to entry? What's preventing new competition from entering this space? And when you think about meat packing, one of those barriers is that there are a lot of regulations, state and federal regulations. Now, ostensibly, a lot of those regulations are designed to improve food safety. Whether they do or not, the impact of those is, something I think that can be discussed. But for example, one of the biggest, examples of regulatory impact is that you have to be federally inspected. You have to pay for federal inspectors to be in a meat packing plant if you want to ship your meat across state lines. And that's a pretty expensive proposition, particularly if you're a relatively small packer. There are different state regulations that you can fall under if you want to only sell within your state. But interestingly, the U.S. government says even if you do a state inspection, it has to be at least as good as, in terms of safety impacts, the federal standards, but you're still not allowed to ship across state lines. So, that's just one example of a myriad of kind of complicated set of rules and regulations that really, impact this sector and may prevent more competition than we would have otherwise.
That's great. I just don't get the state restriction. Because again, just to stress the point is that the USDA deems these state facilities to be equivalent to the federal inspected facilities, yet they still cannot sell meat across the state lines. And then, obviously being able to sell in interstate commerce is pretty important. So one thing that's happening right now, and real quickly, is the Biden administration, I believe, is spending $500 million to help small meat processors and to try to create new processing capacity. Just your take on trying to do that, what impact that might have, if any?
Sure. I mean, of all the things the government could do, that's probably less bad than some others. but honestly, I think if you look at the impact of that investment, in terms of the big picture, it's probably a relatively small impact in terms of total processing capacity. even before the government announced those, those sort of subsidies to encourage more meat packing, there were already a large number of private efforts to introduce, to build some new packing capacity in the system. And so in a way, they may already be subsidizing something that was going to happen already. A lot of it is focused, again, on this kind of small and medium-sized processors. And when you look at sort of their share of total production, it's just a tiny fraction of total production. So again, one can make an argument, maybe it's contributing to local economies. It's increasing options available to local producers. I think those are maybe legitimate arguments, but honestly, I wouldn't expect it to have very much of an impact in terms of just aggregate national level prices that we're seeing on out to the future. And I think one concern I have about those is back to this cattle cycle that I mentioned a moment ago. It is true that we were very tight on packing capacity for the last year or two. We had a large number of cattle and also a large number of hogs relative to our ability to process them. But the just sort of natural cycle was going to mean probably in the next year or two's time period, we were going to come off of some of those constraints already. So we may be subsidizing the addition of more packing capacity at a time when we weren't going to need as much capacity to begin with. So I think one fear I have is we may be waking up 5 years from now and we'll see a number of small and medium-sized packers going out of business because there's just not enough animals relative to the capacity that exists in the future.
Well, the government is, by spending money, it's kind of picking winners and losers, I guess you could say, in this context. Whereas if maybe they address the regulatory regime, maybe some of the unnecessary obstacles, maybe you can actually help the smaller processors that way, and at least that way it's more market driven as opposed to the government deciding.
Yeah, I think one of the things of subsidizing sort of new entrants is you are favoring those new entrants over existing incumbents. And there, while there's some large companies in the space, there are also, particularly when looking at the small and medium-sized packers, there's a lot of local ownership in those. And so in a way, you're putting those existing incumbents at a disadvantage to the new incumbents that are going to come in that have a subsidized level of operation. And so it is in some ways picking winners and losers.
Jason, we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, they tell me we can't. So I really appreciate you joining us today. It was great. And I want to thank all of you who are participating in today's program right now and watching a recording of this event. I encourage you to visit heritage.org to learn more about this issue we've discussed today, our other policy work, and of course, future events. I also encourage you to contact me using the information on your screen if you'd like to continue the conversation. You'll receive a survey immediately following this event. So please complete this if you can, so that we can bring ideas that you care about to the public square. Again, thank you, Jason, and thank you all of you, and have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.